all of this was going on at the same time, trying to sort of hold two camps together in a very quickly degrading tourist situation. I mean, there were less and less people around who wanted to come into all of this. And so Sands and I, back there in the Matus, we were busy doing other things besides running the whole safari thing. And here's our first child, Karina, arriving on the scene. And I find it so interesting looking at all this today. You know, here we are. I mean, you would never find this in a safari camp today with a little family building up with their little kids. And I think that was the whole difference about the early Rhodesian days. There was only about 10 of us kind of camps in the whole country, and they were all very family orientated, and it was quite special. And bringing up little children in this environment was very, very, very special. I mean, they didn't have obviously any things that kids have today, and an old box like this served as a dining table, and it was just extraordinary for them to have been brought up in this. And they were quite different today because of it. And we were starting things like canoeing down the Zambezi, which again, Parks has said for years, no, nobody can canoe the Zambezi, it's far too dangerous. And guys like Paul Connolly and Ed Ross and ourselves got together, and eventually we were doing this, and it was very pioneering stuff. I mean, today, I'm not sure I'd even want to do that because behavior of crocs and hippo have become so used to these boats. But back then, they weren't. And it was all a great experience. Now, you can see a picture of a flushing toilet down there on the left. So a bit of a busy picture, this one. I've just got to talk it through a bit. The camp initially only had a long drop. And I'm just going to go back again to that picture while we talk about this. And Jeff Kent of Abercrombie and Kent Safaris arrived and said, Rob, well, you know, we've got to have flushing toilets, man. And so we set up this one and only flushing toilet, which was surrounded by this kind of very open Mapani barrier with a little stick in the front that you could put in place if it was occupied. And if you hadn't put that in, then you surprised somebody who was in there. And you could look out, but other people hopefully didn't really peer in. And every time you flushed it, there was a great gurgling as it ran into the drum, and everybody knew that you were sitting on the toilet. So it was a bit different, which the Americans absolutely insisted, we can't come unless you've got it. And thank goodness we did that, because a few years later, the bottom picture there is my brother's, who was girlfriend in those days, we called her Fruity, she's his wife now, came to look after this camp while I was invited by an amazing guy called Brian Merriman to go back to the States and make this very, very rough little safari camp his major kind of bush stop for all his very expensive clients who were coming to meet the rich and the famous in Africa. And they would start in Cape Town and end in Cairo, and they would be introduced to the real big deals all the way along the way and go bird shooting and stuff. And then they would arrive in this little camp. And we were in big trouble financially. I mean, the whole place was closing down. There were hotels closing down. There was very little action going on. And for us to make it through, the only reason we could really make it through was we were so remote. And when the sheriff had to come and try and find us, we would quickly make a plan and disappear on a safari somewhere. And the rather ignorant staff would arrive and say, well, no, sorry, the boss is out and you can't find him. And we don't know when he's coming back. And he would very frustratingly leave And so we just got away with all of this until dear old Brian Merriman arrived and said, Rob, I've got to sort this out. So Rob and Sands and a bit of contemplation here. There was lots of contemplation that was needed. And there's quite a big story about how the whole of the Rhodesian business coming out of America was being run from the Air Rhodesia office in those days. That was the really the ambassadorial office of because there were sanctions on and there wasn't allowed to be a proper embassy. And eventually it turned out that this beautiful blonde girl whom we all thought was so dishy and was helping us when we went over there to market was a CIA plant. And she had taken everything that was going on and presented it to the US government, who were supposed to be and were holding up world sanctions against Rhodesia. And suddenly all this amazing business of the Americans that were keeping us going just disappeared, because they closed it all down, and they said, and there were huge fines given to these agents. And so we were back to just survival mode, kept alive mostly by the farmers in those days, who didn't mind traveling up and down on the convoys and stuff and braved the roads. And that great Rhodesian farming community was really what kept us all going for a good while. I just want you to notice the water level here. You can see it's quite, I'm just getting this thing in onto my thing. It's quite far back. We're probably about, 3 meters down from where we are actually in the camp. And this was one of the things that I hadn't found out too much about in taking the solo all over, is that this camp that we were in was actually under the high water level. And when we arrived back in the 70s, the lake was very low. It was still filling, and it hadn't got anywhere near we were under drought, and it hadn't got anywhere near its full level. So and I didn't sort of pay much attention to all that. I thought, well, this is great, as long as we can just keep it down there. But of course, it didn't keep down there. So it was coming up year by year. And a quick little flashback onto Kariba being built. And, amazingly, here the lake is filling. Now, you all go up there today and see this huge lake. Well, look at all this land. That's the high ground, and that would have been Fothergill back there, and then the river coming in there. And so why Fothergill was so full of game was that the game used to walk through Fothergill on this high ground and then come down here. This would have been one of the islands just on the Zambian side. And once the lake was full, they had a bit of a problem going on across. But there was a day when 3 bull elephants started to move further and further out. And up to then, I think people had said, well, how far can an elephant swim? And they'd say, well, probably about 5 kilometers. And those 3 elephants eventually swam 25 kilometers right across the lake and landed up in Kariba. And an amazing thing. And when they got, after you can imagine it, having been swimming for a full night and 2 days in between, they arrived and got out. 1 drowned on the way, and the other 2 simply couldn't drink enough. They sort of sat there and drank for about an hour because they couldn't drink on the crossing. And here's old Rupert himself, who the island was named after. Amazing guy who went out and organized that Operation Noah, which a lot of you know about, rescuing as many as he could. Of course, thousands and thousands of animals did disappear and die. And I think it's a huge question today whether, I'm sure today that lake would never be actually allowed to be built, because there was an incredible 300 kilometers of amazing Zambezi Valley that was lost through that. But anyway, that's all another story. So let me just get on to the thing. The Parks guys allowed us to build these rather lovely tree houses on lakes, on trees in the water, which was a great experience for somebody to come and actually be able to sit and spend a couple of nights actually up there, and just hear everything and see everything moving around, but being very secure. And they were huge fun. And as you can see, young family growing, with old Boone very excited about it, at least he was. And Jeff Stutchbury, who was our great opposition on spurring, had built this very much smarter tree house than ours. And Jeff was an extraordinary pioneer in all of this world. I mean, today you know all the camps that are on the lake, and were. There must have been at least 30 at one point, and they're probably rising up to that again now. But when we started all of this, there was just Jeff, who'd started on spurring, which had been a fishing camp before. It was called Tyler's Camp, a bit like King's Camp is. And he somehow had got a lease to lease that. And he was very fed up with us coming into his Methuselah that he regarded as his own. But he was a wonderful guy, Jeff, and we had our difficulties to start with, but we ended up being great friends. So back here, building up the family, and down there at the bottom, I just want to look at that picture. This is Russell and Lynn Taylor, who were the research wardens. He was the research warden in the Methuselah. And John, who was the full-on warden of the Methuselah, was very much a part of our lives, of course, these guys. We were the only camp in the whole of the Methuselah. Jeff was outside, he was on an island, and they had already been told by the park's head office that this guy was not supposed to be in the park. And I had thought I'd bought a camp with everything, and you know, incredible to think back of how little research I really did in it, or to find out that actually Parks had told the guys who'd had this camp before, you may not be inside the park, and you've got to find somewhere outside the park to build your camp. Well, there was a war on, and we couldn't sort of head off into the local tribal trust lands with all the kind of kooks that were running around in there. And so every year they would come back and they would say, well, where are you going, Rob? And I'd say, well, what about this Fothergill? You know, can I go into that? Oh, no, that's going to be a part of the park. And this went on and on and on until that's an interesting picture. Sorry, I'm going to just quickly go back to that. There was a war on. And so there is Rob in his police uniform having a last cuddle with his youngest before heading out, having a bit of a chat with old Bunu, probably along the lines of, well, good luck, Bus, and don't forget Squidit for Tyson, who's going on leave, and hope to see you back soon, but bring us some fish here, boss. And so we would head out for 2 weeks at a time, and we'd be back for 2 weeks. And that extraordinary little structure that you see in the background was our office, which Sands would now run the camp on her own while I was away. And it was an incredible time, that Rhodesian time. I mean, lots of you know all about that. But because we were so remote and they wanted some presence in there, I didn't have to go for long periods, but it was 2 weeks in and 2 weeks out, and 2 weeks in and 2 weeks out. And it brought a great strain, as you all know, onto everything. But that's how it was. And we started to build up a boat fleet. We originally had one 18-foot cougar, which is just an open craft with a 50 horsepower Mercury on the back. And that was our entire boat transport to get to and from Kariba, bring everybody, bring all the supplies. And there was a story when we had staff. In those days, staff who worked in a safari camp were paid absolute peanuts. And we regarded it as a treat for you to be able to even work here. And so chaps would pitch up from all over the place, and they'd come in and go out. And one day an ex-paratrooper from the British Army arrived, and his name was Jim, and he was a very capable guy, and he seemed to have met everybody that was anything and could do anything, anytime, anywhere. And he was great. And one day he headed off in this boat and had to take some empties back with him. And on the way back, he hadn't crossed the lake other than arriving. He mistook the Zambian town of Siavonga as Kariba. And he drove our boat into this, and there were some soldiers sort of indicating that he should get onto come into the jetty. And he suddenly realized what he'd done and where he was. And he was quite clever about it, and a good sort of paratrooper reaction where he thought, well, sheesh, I'm going to quickly come up with a plan here. So he pretended he was fiddling with the motor, trying to get it to sort out. And these guys were indicating that he should come across. And then he turned around and just opened up the throttle on this 50 horsepower Mercury, which slowly kind of pulled out of the harbor. And these guys opened up at him. And he was down, crouching behind all these empties, which got shattered in the glass. And he arrived to pick up the guests who were waiting in Kariba with all this shattered glass. And they thought he'd had a bit of a rough crossing, and he didn't really explain anything to anybody. He said, sorry about this, I'm just going to get everything out. And when they arrived back, they were friends of mine, and they said, wow, Rob, we didn't realize that you'd had so much weather today. Only afterwards did I understand the story. One of those times, hey, when things just turn out right, hey. So we bought eventually this beautiful, great big Boss Jim that was a 20-foot open boat that had been in Operation Noah and belonged to Jim Samuels, who'd run breweries all those years ago, so we called it after him. And this began to be the most amazing new kind of thing for us. Not only could we take people up to about 10 at a time if we needed to, but it would be loaded up with all the goods that we needed. And that boat would be sitting with about 1 foot of freeboard left once it was loaded, and you'd cross over. And if you hit weather on the way, it would just pile in. And so I always had to have at least 2 crew to bail the boat to keep it floating. And we'd arrive on the other side, and it would just kind of beach and settle onto the bottom, and we'd offload it. And it was an incredibly great innovation for us. And then there was this little kanjiri at the bottom, which Jeff Stutchby had come up with this idea of joining 2 canoes to make into a catamaran like this. And you sat in the middle and drove it, and your guest sat on each side with a very little freeboard, as you can see. So if you hit weather in that too, it was all, I mean, these were hairy experiences, which everybody just got used to. That's how it was. And then, of course, this very great innovation of having a raft that we just built up out of 44-gallon drums joined together. And that was our main fishing raft, and it would go out and collect firewood. And it was all extremely primitive kind of stuff compared to what goes on today. And here's this beautiful, beautiful, what makes the whole Metusanana operation so incredible is just to be able to arrive like this right next to Buffalo, which you couldn't possibly do if you were on the land. And it was part of that very special experience, but we're not talking about animals today. And then this amazing hydrofoil. My gosh, this just absolutely turned us all around. In the middle of a war where everything was closing down, this had been bought by the Lake Shipping Company because their ferries, they only had the Seahorse in those days, that traveled up and down the lake, went through the Chetty Gorge one day and got ambushed. And there were, one of the tourists was killed, and there was it was quite an incident. So the Lake Shipping Company, in a very brave way, then found this hydrofoil in Italy and shipped it through against all the world sanctions that there was, incredibly, arrived with us, and it now, if you were going up the lake, you jumped onto the hydrofoil, and it took 4 hours to get up the lake while your car came along in the Seahorse and took 24 hours to get there. So you whizzed up and got to Malabisi and waited there for your car and had a nice time in the lodge while you waited. Well, one day, unfortunately, dear old Alec Gibson, who was the driver, because they used to stop at Boomy to pick up people on the way. There was only Spurwing, ourselves, and Boomy on the lake in those days. So Boomy, of course, was quite a fancy big hotel compared to us. And so the hydrofoil would pop in there and drop people off and pick them up. And they loved that because it was quite a logistic nightmare for them getting things up and down in the lake. And he was doing a bit of game viewing on the way out, and he hit a stump on one of the foils, and the boat sunk. So that sadly was the end of the Lake Shipping Company operation. And the hydrofoil was then eventually rescued and taken up by a insurance company and offered for sale to whoever wanted it in Salisbury. And this guy, Ian Fickard, who was a most extraordinary man, arrived, and he said, I'm going to turn this into something. And he was just a finance man. He ran the Dale Carnegie course of making good friends quickly and getting rich before they realized it. And he built this whole boat up on a kind of a finance scheme that he set up himself. And the next thing is we had this amazing hydrofoil parked in Kariba in the middle of these war years. This is back in the early 70s. And just everybody arrived in Kariba and, of course, had to get on this hydrofoil and roar around the lake on it. Meanwhile, we were bashing backwards and forwards across in our little 50 horsepower Mercury. So we made a deal with them to come over and bring people, and they would roar across the lake, doesn't matter what the weather was, in about 20 or 30 minutes. And then our little raft would go out and pick everybody up, because he had to park out there in the deep water. And it would take them about the same time they'd come all the way from Kariba just to get in the little raft with our 2-3 horsepower Seagull or something to get back into the land. And we would give them lunch and take them for a drive, and they'd head back. But wow, what a treat it all was to have them around. And the Rhodesians built a postage stamp to celebrate this great boat. But now you see that picture down the bottom there. That's actually the lake level. Now, sandbags stopping the wave action from washing straight into the dining room. We were in trouble. We were in big trouble. And the next year, it was going to come higher, and it was actually going to go right over this whole camp. And dear old Colin Saunders, who was the head of the National Parks Board in those days, was doing his annual thing as he did every year around all the camps. And he said to us, well, what are you guys going to do? And we said, well, what the hang is the holdup about this Fothergill? I mean, every year we've been asking, and we eventually found out that one of the ministers, good old stuff, had set this aside as his retirement plan. And so, no, it wasn't available. But now, actually, in the middle of a war, and things weren't looking quite so good as having a retirement plan on Fothergill Island, I think we might be able to make a plan here, Rob. And so suddenly, out of the blue, 3 months later, Fothergill was put up for tender. And amazingly, within weeks, I think we were the only people who tendered. Everybody else was closing stuff down. Fothergill was available.